I remember back in 2018 that Putin actually announced that there were several different new weapon systems, missiles in particular, in development, and they would be appearing, in the following years. And one of them was the Burevestnik that was announced just yesterday. The announcement was concerning a successful test. It flew 14,000 kilometers and was able to conduct, a variety of vertical and horizontal maneuvers. So I'm going to say that 14,000, it flew for 15 hours. 14,000 kilometers is actually, is maybe the low end of its range. It could easily, apparently, fly 20,000 kilometers. It can go halfway around the globe. So in other words, it can actually hit any point on the globe. Yeah, this was something that he promised back then. And I remember when he promised these new missile systems back in 2018, the announcement was greeted with ridicule in the U.S. Partly, I guess, because they had rather clunky graphics or something to show this is like, because that's something we're really good at. We have generally anyway, very flashy graphics and whatever. And I guess that's the way Americans judge things these days. How flashy are your graphics? And theirs were very clunky. So it was just a big joke. But now, in the meantime, they've come out with two hypersonic missiles, a hypersonic cruise missile, hypersonic ballistic missiles that they have been using in
Wait,
Ukraine.
this Burevestnik is hypersonic?
This is not hypersonic.
Oh, okay,
no.
so
Yeah, but anyway, two hypersonic missiles. We're talking about the Zircon and the Kinjal, which have been used several times. The Kinjal in particular, many times in Ukraine, and now this the Burevestnik, which is a nuclear. It has a nuclear engine, and so it's virtually it could stay up there. I don't know how long, but there's almost no real limit on it. It can just be up there forever. And the thing is, it can, because it's a cruise missile and it's very maneuverable, it can take all kinds of evasive actions on the way to its target, and it is therefore very, very difficult to shoot down. It can fly just very, very close to the surface, over water or over ground. And yeah, no, it's obviously a major development. It shows something very, very strange, about the West. The West is all talk and is very, very self-confident, very smug. It was as other analysts have pointed out, I think, including Alexander Mercouris, it was the U.S. that broke all these missile treaties that we had with the Soviet Union and then Russia. We broke them, unilaterally. And I think the thinking was, well, we don't need to even respect Russia anymore. Especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's just like we can kick them around. What's the point of having a treaty with them? We'll just, we'll do what we want. But what's happened is that actually it's the Russians that have come up with the new systems and we haven't. We simply haven't, we haven't made these same breakthroughs, which seems to me quite extraordinary. And there's just a lack of, I guess it's just a product of this extraordinary smugness. Say that, well, we are number one, so why do we need to try? I remember back when I was a kid, maybe these ads still exist, but I don't watch TV anymore or anything. But back when I was a kid, you would often, there was a rental agency called Avis. Hertz was number one, Avis was number two, but Avis would actually highlight the fact they were number two. It says, we're number two, so we try harder. And I think maybe that's part of what's going on, sort of like we're Hertz, we're resting on our laurels, for these past couple of decades. And Russia, and, when it comes to military systems, it saw itself as number two, and they tried harder, and they've come up with these new systems that are now well ahead of what the Americans have.
Do you think there is some reality hitting home within the Trump administration or the Pentagon when they see these types of missile systems? Like when we say we have to offer the Tomahawks or we can't supply them with the Patriot interceptors because we can't produce any, isn't it becoming apparent to NATO and people that, we miscalculated. We thought that the U.S., MIC was more powerful than what it really was. It seems like it was all smoke and mirrors. we're seeing our adversaries, China and Russia, just roll out very advanced weapons. I heard China now has a radar system that operates from space that basically renders any type of U.S. stealth technology, irrelevant now. Now, I'm not exactly sure if that's 100% true, but I have seen a lot of missiles and advanced tech that China's rolling out at a huge scale. And we're seeing just the capability of the Russian MIC in Ukraine. So has it hit home? Are we starting to?
I don't know that it has. I mean, I am sure, I have no doubt that there are analysts, experts, within these military establishments, whether we're talking about the U.S. or NATO and Europe, that do see what's going on and are making reports, but it's not clear that has made it up to the top. We're not seeing any sign of that. Maybe they're discussing these things very nervously behind closed doors, but we don't see any evidence of that. There just still seems to be this supreme smugness at the top.
Yeah, you think that the announcements of these new weapon systems should put a little bit of caution in the United States. I mean, like with this nuclear-powered cruise missile you're talking about, basically when I was looking at it, it just said range unlimited, which I feel like is a bit of an exaggeration, right? But it's nuclear-powered, but
Yeah.
it can go forever. But basically that means you can just have this thing flying around, and usually when you're putting in missile defense systems, you have an idea of where the missile's coming from, so you can orientate your missile defense systems to protect from the area of attack. But with this missile, it could just go around the world and hit you from behind. It could literally go anywhere for as long as it wants and just stay low. So you can't really build a defense system against it unless you cover the entire territory, which is pretty much impossible.
Yeah. One thing that you can say is actually reassuring about the system is that you can do, let's say, if the tensions reach some sort of fever pitch and it looks like a nuclear strike might be imminent. Well, the Russians can actually send up a number of these cruise missiles, but they can have them, let's say, circling the Arctic Ocean or something like that, or doing whatever, going off in different directions, but they don't have to strike because they can be up there for, who knows, maybe for a day or longer. And then when it becomes clear that, okay, the threat is past, they can actually call them back. I mean, that's the possibility. And the problem with the hypersonic missiles, of course, is that you just have a few minutes, especially when you're talking about the intermediate ranges in Europe. And that's one reason that we had that intermediate range treaty, is that it just put everything on a hair trigger. And with hypersonic, that becomes even more of a problem. You have a minute to decide or something. And that's just really a terrifying situation. And the Russians are saying, hey, let's work out some treaties here. And the Americans just haven't responded. And I think the hope is with this announcement, it's just like, okay, you're not listening to anything we say. Maybe you'll pay attention to what we do. If we actually develop these new systems, you'll see it's in your interest actually to come to the table and for us to work out something that will make the world a safer place. But we have not. Again, the Russians have offered to extend the START treaty. Trump said, "Oh yeah, that seems like a good idea," and again, but he never got back to him. He's still on his merry-go-round.
Right. It's got to be very frustrating for the Russians because I think they're trying to reestablish deterrence because we've had this salami slicing, and Putin has been exercising restraint and constantly just sort of working with with Trump and trying to find an off ramp, but it's just clearly not working. We're just seeing these continued escalations. So, do you think that this will establish deterrence in some sense? But I just feel like
not.
Exactly. That's what I think. It's just like, how far can you go? I think maybe since we have been able to fire scalp missiles and attack them, and so into pre-existing, Russian borders, pre-2014 Russia, then I think that has kind of maybe opened things up. Maybe that's something that Putin shouldn't have allowed, because now it's just kind of said, oh, the Russians, you can actually strike into Russia and it's okay. Like, we don't have to worry about them. And I think Putin is trying to reestablish deterrence by demonstrating these weapons. But do you think he can? Or there's no, what would it take?
It's just hard to, the problem is when you have an irrational rival, it becomes a real problem. The U.S. was rational during the Cold War. It doesn't mean that everything they did was right or anything, but they were rational. They understood the risks. They respected the Soviet red lines. I'm just not sure that we are rational and that we are, sober again. And maybe we'll go back to this concept of smugness. There's a lack of fear. We used to have a healthy fear, and we just don't seem to have it. Putin continues to be attacked by a lot of people, both I think within Russia, but also within the, let's say, among the geopolitical dissidents. There are people that are really angry that he hasn't been harsher. And, I actually get it. I think they may be right, at least to, and they probably are right, at least to some extent. But, and maybe I'm trying to rationalize Putin's moves, but I can understand them. Like going back, if the failure to establish deterrence, like at the end of last year, you have to remember the situation. It was, it was the end of the Biden administration. He was on his way out. Trump was on his way in. Okay, they started these strikes, and the Russians did make this, one demonstrative response with the Burevestnik. Hey, look, this is what we have, and then didn't do anything. But they had a statement, of course, a very, very forceful statement from Trump back then that he thought it was stupid and that he wasn't going to do this. And so they say, okay, look, Biden has done this. Again, maybe the way that Putin looked at it is that we don't escalate right now. Because escalation, even though it might be generally necessary in order to establish a deterrence, it is risky. It could be that rather than establishing deterrence, there's a counter-escalation, and then we're in real trouble. So I think it was a rational move at that time. But whatever you do, there is a risk. And it seems like, okay, yeah, it seemed to work for the first several months. The Americans they stopped launching these missiles. Now, it's not entirely clear that they have, but it seems like there have been, the Russian Ministry of Defense hasn't admitted to them. We don't have any direct satellite evidence. But it seems that there were some storm shadow strikes on a chemical plant. It seems like that. We're not sure. And if that happened, then that would be, a return to the Biden strikes on pre-2014 territory with missiles that really have to be programmed, again, by NATO. So they are NATO strikes on Russia. And then we're back to where we were. Now, Putin, and there was all that talk about the tomahawks, and then Putin was very restrained about it. Again, I'll speak on Putin's behalf. I think that he did have a psychological profile that you just don't throw the gauntlet down to Trump. You have to talk to him in person. And so he just did not say anything. But then he made that phone call. And after that, you have to say, at least for now, we're on a merry-go-round, but at least for now, the tomahawks are off. So I think he did get through to him that way. And I think, if you can do it that way rather than, I don't know, striking a base in Romania or whatever, that's good. I mean, that may be necessary at some point for the Russians to do that, but if they can avoid it, that's good. So I am going to, stand in Putin's corner on this. And now, though, with the sudden reversal about the summit talks the
sanctions,
the sanctions, they were very hostile, and then also the Trump's reversal on the understanding. Now he's pushing for a ceasefire. All that happened, and clearly Putin has had enough of it. So he did actually, whereas before he wouldn't say it, this time he said there will be an overwhelming, very serious, if not overwhelming response, is what he said. So he's getting back to it. So, we're back to that very dangerous situation, where I think Trump or Putin does understand the need for deterrence. He saw some ways, that maybe he could work through diplomacy. And I think it's right. Again, maybe I'm just a softie like Putin when it comes to this, and I don't understand the hard realities. I do get the arguments that the other people say. But anyway, I think that, that Putin wasn't wrong to try to explore these possibilities, but he is, he's a very smart man, and he's surrounded by people who are clearly pointing out the perfidy and the unreliability of their partners in America. And he seems to have, accepted their position. So, his most recent statements have actually been quite harsh. And so we may see some, if there is another strike, I don't know, neither side is talking about that chemical plant. And maybe what happened is it did occur, and the Russians said, hey, secretly, this is something that Biden was doing. And remember what we said about this is a red line for us. We'll just pretend this one didn't happen. But if it happens again, we're going to have to respond. We'll see.